Hi everyone. So just to let you know, we're in Hall A at the moment and we'll be looking at who gains from trade. Or in Hall B, you will be able to tune into diversity and humanization. So I think there should be a poll coming up over the next few seconds. So as we wait for a minute or two, just allow for some more people to join the session. Please feel free to fill that in, just a multiple choice question. Okay. And for everyone else, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for today's panel. I hope you've been able to enjoy our keynotes and our networking session earlier today. And if not, there'll be plenty more opportunities to engage with those later in the conference. But for now, hopefully you're energized and ready to engage with the topic today. I'm Ada, and I'll be the moderator for today's panel, Who Gains in Trade, RCEP, and the AEC. We'll be looking at and in and around trade in ASEAN and its dialogue partners and the political complexities that must be addressed when considering equitable growth and development. Our hope for today is that no matter what your current position and knowledge of ASEAN is, you'll be able to come away with some new insights applicable to the growing conversation around global economics. With ASEAN projected to be one of the largest economies over the next decade, it will definitely be a region to watch. And hopefully this panel will be able to spark your interest in learning more. So here's what to expect for today. I'll first be taking a few moments to briefly introduce each of the panelists and then tell you a little bit more about their experience around trade and economics. We'll then launch right into panelist discussion, asking some pre-prepared questions that draw out some key issues surrounding trade in the ASEAN and how ASEAN may ultimately seek to support its future growth, regional integration, and cooperation. We'll begin this discussion with some slightly drier contextual explanation of what exactly the AEC and the RCEP are, as in the title, just to give you guys some background information to these issues. After this, we'll get right into issues such as equitable development, development divides, competition, small and medium enterprises, protectionism, etc. And finally, we'll head right into our Q&A. So this will give you guys an opportunity to ask our speakers some further questions that you have around trade or around anything that's been brought up during the topic. So please feel free to send in these questions as the discussion progresses, but if you'd like to wait till the end, that's okay as well. So now to introduce our panelists. Firstly, we have attorney Alan Bigepti, who is a lawyer with diverse experience in international trade, intellectual property, public international law, commercial law, and litigation. He was the Philippines' lead negotiator in the RCEP. Currently, he is the Assistant Secretary for Industry Development and Trade Policy Group at the Department of Trade Industry, handling international trade policy and trade negotiations at bilateral, regional, and multilateral levels. He is also the country's senior economic official at the ASEAN. He was a former Deputy Director General of Intellectual Property Office of the Philippines and a Commissioner of the Philippines Tariff Commission. Next, we have Dr. Shira Armstrong, who is an Associate Professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy in the College of Asia and the Pacific at the Australian National University. He is the Director of the Australia-Japan Research Centre, Editor of the East Asia Forum, and Director of the East Asian Bureau of Economic Research. Elizabeth Bowles was appointed, next we have Elizabeth Bowles, who was appointed Chief Negotiator in DFAT's Regional Trade Agreements Division in January 2020, and First Assistant Secretary in May 2020. Ms. Bowles has also previously served as the Minister Counselor of Trade at the Australian Embassy in Washington, DC, where she oversaw bilateral trade relations and broader trade policy, climate change and energy, as well as infrastructure and transportation issues. She was also previously posted as Counselor to Australia's permanent mission to the WTO in Geneva. And finally, we have Dr. J Menon. Following his early retirement from the Asian Development Blog, where he was lead economist in the Office of the Chief Economist, Dr. Menon has joined the ICAS Yusof Institute in Singapore in 2020 to continue his work on trade and development in the Asian region. He first started work as an academic in Australia, spending almost a decade at the Centre of Policy Studies at Monash University. He's also worked at and held adjunct appointments at a number of universities globally, including in Australia, the US, Japan, the UK, Malaysia, and Singapore. And that's our panel for today. So hopefully that gives you guys a bit of an idea of the expertise which our panelists carry with them, and exactly how fortunate we are to have them engaged in this discussion today. So just a quick note on the poll that was filled out. It turns out that environmental standards was the most popular answer, which is correct. So yes, the RCEP doesn't cover environmental standards, but we know that the issue of environmentally sustainable growth is an important one nonetheless. And there'll be another panel tomorrow afternoon exploring this issue in more detail if you'd like to find out more. But for now, let's begin with this panel. So as noted before, we'll go into some contextual explanation around trade in ASEAN, beginning first with the AEC. Dr. Jayant, a fair amount of your research has been into regional economic integration and cooperation. So would you be able to explain to us, I guess, what the purposes and goals of the AEC are and why this is so important for the ASEAN people?
Sure. Thank you, Ida. And let me start by thanking you for having me and congratulating all of you for putting on such a great event and the fabulous organization that's gone into it. Right. So with respect to regional cooperation and the AEC, I guess the first point to keep in mind, now I'm beginning to forget actually what your question was after the introduction. Can you just tell me what it was again?
Yes, of course. So just looking at what the purposes and the goals of the AEC are and why it's so important for the ASEAN people.
Sure. Yes. Okay. Sorry, I was so taken up with trying to congratulate you, I forgot what you asked me. So, yeah. So the goals of the AEC are very broadly defined. There's three pillars. There's an economic, there's a social, political, and there's a security. And we often focus on the economic because it's the main one. And for me, I'll do that too because it's the only one that I feel sort of able to comment on. So it's designed to actually create not a free market in the region, as you would expect in the EU, for instance, but something that approximates it, but with Asian flavor, which is, a bit more flexible. This is an organization that works on consensus-based decision making, so you can't, aspire to the highest standards. So we want to have a relatively free flow of goods and services, of investment, of skilled labor so far, but critically, it's supposed to be a single production base. And this is where, it tries to consolidate or support and consolidate the supply chains in the region, which are critical to the economic prospects of all of the ASEAN countries involved. So that's pretty much what it aspires to. But we should always remember that ASEAN was born not as an economic entity, but as a political security forum during the Vietnam War. And so it's also about, keeping the peace, ensuring good relations amongst the members, providing a clearinghouse for disputes, although, it's not the ASEAN way to actually go very formal with these things. It has a dispute settlement mechanism which has never been used, but it does provide a forum to clear the air as it's required. And finally, I guess it does also ensure that we lock in a lot of the reforms during periods of crises or low growth, like we're going through right now. You don't want countries backtracking too much, and these sorts of agreements, to some extent, tie the hands of politicians to stop them from going back, or succumbing to the temptation to raise barriers, during difficult times. So that's the broad, sort of objectives, I think, of the AEC. Let me finish with one point. The AEC was set a target initially of 2020. They moved it forward to 2015. And of course, when 2015 arrived, there were still things to be done. So they said that, the AEC has been established, but not implemented. So now we have 2025 as the new deadline, and we are working towards that. Yeah, so let me stop there.
Okay, all good. Just maybe a little bit of a follow-up question. Something that you mentioned was that, that a lot of ASEAN countries tend to use it as a forum of discussion, and so it's not super strictly implemented. So are there any other issues that, I know you mentioned that as one, but are there any other issues that you think may limit progress towards realizing the AEC, particularly as we look towards that 2025 goal?
Right. So that's a good point that you raise. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the ASEAN way is not to rush to court every time someone is not doing something they agreed to. I like to say that ASEAN is all about the carrot because there's no stick. So, countries have to feel that it's in their interests to actually pursue these sorts of reforms. And many of these reforms involve short-term adjustment costs or short-term pain for longer-term gains. And usually that pain is concentrated amongst a small group, and the gains are usually spread over a larger community, usually the broad community, often in lower prices and so on. So there's a lot of things that automatically make it difficult to pursue these sorts of reforms, right? Their costs are immediate and very concentrated. So people have interest to organize and lobby against them. The benefits are long-term and they are thinly spread. So there's no incentive for consumers to come together to try and ensure that these things happen. So governments must be convinced of the benefits. And the challenge that poses is to sell the benefits. There's a lot of implementation difficulties. It's easy to sign agreements and have press conferences declaring that these things have already been done. But when you go home, you have to deal with these vested interests. You have to work with the legislative process, often changing laws, and these are quite challenging. But ASEAN's done pretty well. I think it struck the balance between not doing too much and not doing nothing at all either, and that's been quite. I think that's been its saving grace. That's why we still have it with us, more than 50 years after it was created.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's quite helpful in giving us a pretty comprehensive overview of what the AEC is and maybe some of the issues that come along with it as well. So I guess to continue on in a similar vein, one aspect of the AEC's goals is for the region's integration into the global economy. And so with RCEP's negotiations having begun in 2012 and the ratification of the RCEP expected to occur early next year, it will have been almost 10 years in the making. So that gives us some indication of just how much effort has gone into this agreement. So I think it might be good to look at what exactly the RCEP is, perhaps its key features and what differentiates it from previous bilateral trade agreements. So Attorney Allen, as the Philippines' lead negotiator for the RCEP, would you be able to give us some insight into that?
Thank you, Ada, for having me in this very important forum. And congratulations to UNSW and, of course, to your organization. On the question on the value and importance of RCEP, before I answer the same, I just want to give some context on the discussion. Number one, I think we have to bear in mind that the 21st century is the resurgence of Asia. So when it comes to economic activities, the same has shifted from North America and Europe to Asia. And when you talk about Asia, you cannot afford not to talk about Southeast Asia. Thus, you have to recognize the value and importance or the role of ASEAN in this scheme of things. Now, since the Charter of Economic Activities are now in Asia, and I think if you will check the configuration of RCEP region, that is basically the biggest market in the world right now, the biggest free trade area. As of course reported several times, it accounts to 30% of the world's GDP, 30% of the world's trade, and of course, not to mention the 2.3 billion market. And talking about economic activities in the region, 50% of the manufacturing output are in the region. 70% when it comes to electronics, and also when it comes to automotive products, 50%, 60% for electrical machineries, and even petrochemical products. And of course, there are many indicators that basically would tell you that all the economic activities are gravitating towards Asia. Now, ASEAN, as we all know, is strategically located in the region. And we have this ASEAN Economic Community composed of 10 ASEAN member states. And as mentioned earlier by Dr. Menon, of course, our vision is to have an economic community. But of course, right now, there are many aspects that we have to take into account. But as it is, you have to look at it as a single market and a production base. Now, taking into account the diverse economic situation in Asia, in Southeast Asia, as well as the legal regime in the 10 ASEAN member states, then you will see diversity for so many reasons. I mean, cultural, religion, historical attachment, and even priorities. So from that angle, you will see that ASEAN on its own cannot afford to have an inward policy. So in other words, it has to expand. It has to come up with a wider economic integration with its trading partners. Thus, we have this series of ASEAN +1. And on that aspect, that's where as RCEP becomes very important. Because in RCEP, you have integrated now these 15 economies, these 15 countries into one big single market. And I think that's a very strategic move, because we have to maintain our comparative advantage since it has already shifted here. So that's one. Now, how is this different from other bilateral agreements? Of course, there are many differences because number one, this is a regional agreement. And when it comes to coverage, then it is comprehensive. So we have the series of ASEAN +1 with our trading partners. So in terms of coverage, this is very broad because it is not just limited to goods. It has services, it has investment, and of course, other emerging areas in trade, such as intellectual property. You have e-commerce, which is very important right now, competition policies, government procurement, and even a chapter on small and medium enterprises. So when it comes to coverage, when it comes to commitment, of course, this is far different from those ASEAN +1 FTAs. And again, with respect to opportunities that it creates, it's also different. Because in terms of sourcing of raw materials alone, in terms of integration with the whole process or production line in the GBC, then it will open a platform for opportunities for micro, small, and medium enterprises to be integrated into this system. So basically, that's it, Ada. I'll have to stop for now. I know that there are so many subjects or things that I can expound further, but maybe to give time for further discussion, I'll stop there.
No worries. I think that's pretty clear. I think there's a really good integration of the role that ASEAN plays. And we'll have a little bit more opportunity to talk about small and medium enterprises later on. But just a little, just to focus a little bit more on RCEP before we begin with the rest of the discussion. Elizabeth, as another trade negotiator, were there any particular aspects of this that you'd like to give further emphasis or explanation on, or anything that you think Attorney Allen may have missed as well?
Thanks very much, Ada, and thank you also to the organisers, the University of New South Wales. This is a terrific conference, and it's really very admirable the way in which everyone has managed to organise it in this virtual format. And I didn't have the pleasure of negotiating RCEP. I have been involved with other FTA negotiations, but I am now responsible for getting RCEP ready for ratification in the Australian system and entering into force, which I hope will be in early next year. And just to pick up perhaps on a couple of elements that Alan highlighted, for Australia in particular, a very core distinguishing feature of RCEP is Asean Centrality. That really is the cornerstone of RCEP, and it will remain crucial for RCEP's successful implementation. So just to really highlight the Asean centrality of this agreement. And ASEAN centrality is something which Australia very firmly supports. We're committed to a free and open Indo-Pacific, one that is inclusive and resilient, and that is in line with the principles of the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific. But what's also very critical is the contribution that this agreement can make as part of ASEAN and its institutions to the region's economic recovery and security, in particular post-COVID-19. Now, for Australia in particular, one of the distinguishing features, or many of the distinguishing features for RCEP, is the fact that given there are 15 members of RCEP, it will strengthen our links with the region. RCEP includes 9 of Australia's top 15 trading partners, so it will bring in 9 of our top trading partners into what Alan described as a single economic framework. Now, for us, RCEP countries account for 59% of our trade and 67% of our exports. So that's a really important framework in which we're operating here. Its rules will provide predictability and transparency in the business region. So to really go to the nuts and bolts, there will be a single set of rules and procedures in order to access preferential tariffs in the RCEP market. Now that's a key difference between the situation under RCEP and what exists now, where our businesses in Australia can choose from between 10 different FTAs across 15 different RCEP countries to access those markets. So that single set of rules and procedures is really important, as Alan said, to really ensuring access to global value chains. There will also be additional avenues to tackle non-tariff barriers. So we've spoken about access, preferential access to markets, but tackling behind the border barriers will be improved by transparency and promoting cooperation. And in particular, there is also a common base of rules to protect and promote investment that underpins value chains, such as rights to due process and to repatriate funds. So these are all core distinguishing features of RCEP as a single economic framework that really do distinguish RCEP as what will be the world's biggest FTA from all the other bilateral FTAs to which Australia is a party. Thanks, Ada.
Well, good. Thank you so much to both Attorney Alan and to Elizabeth as well for your insights on such an important trade deal. So now that that's been outlined briefly, this should be able to provide our audience with some helpful background for some of the issues that tend to accompany global trade and how they can be addressed. So I guess we'll go right into it. The RCEP seems to offer fairly significant opportunities for ASEAN's economic growth, particularly with you guys mentioning trade deals and I think, the rule of origin and how that might be able to help global value chains. But perhaps another aim that we should, I think, maybe discuss is that of development. So equitable development is one of the goals of the ASEAN Economic Community. But within and between ASEAN member states, there exists some sort of development divide. I guess, Jay, would you be able to give some insight on what this means and why these gaps matter to ASEAN's goals for the AEC and for RCEP and ultimately its people?
Sure. Right. So I hope you can hear me clearly, but let me know if you can't. The first point, I guess, to make is that ASEAN, as Alan mentioned, is very diverse. RCEP adds to that diversity even further. So those development gaps were there before ASEAN started, or RCEP hasn't started yet, but it's already there. But the question is whether they're narrowing. On pure economic terms, crudely measured by per capita GDP or income, these gaps are narrowing in ASEAN. The poorest countries, the newest members, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam, have been growing faster on average than the original members. So, you have this convergence taking place in per capita incomes, at least. There are lots of other things that divide the region, and some of them are narrowing, the others are not. But what we see is happening as countries converge, inequality within countries is rising. So the type of policies that are producing rapid economic growth, or more rapid economic growth in the newer members, is also producing increased inequality within those countries as well. So that's something to bear in mind. Inter-country inequality is falling, but intra-country inequality is rising. That needs to be addressed. But we want to have a more equal region, generally, if you're looking to build a community. This is, self-evident. But the economic incomes alone is only part of that story. There is this digital divide, which has become much more prominent now with COVID. This needs to be addressed as well going forward. And there's lots of other things as well. If you're talking about how COVID is affecting this whole process, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, is a good measure of general development beyond just income. And, these countries were struggling to meet those targets before the pandemic. And as a result, they didn't cope very well with the pandemic compared to those who had made more progress. And now, as a result of that, they are even further away from those targets. So this is a vicious circle that we have to try and break in the region to try and lift the newest members to catch up even faster on all these other non-economic areas, if you're going to try and build a community. So there's a lot of work to be done. So just to summarize then, incomes are converging between countries, but not within countries. Inequality is rising within countries. In the non-income areas, there are still lots of gaps, and growth alone won't solve a lot of those problems. So we need to look at much more targeted measures. A final point is that we can't overly rely on regional organizations to fill the development gaps. ASEAN, for instance, has got a program to try and fill those gaps within the region. But the richest countries in ASEAN are tiny, right? Singapore and Brunei, and dare I say it, not terribly generous. So they're not going to pay for a huge program of development. You don't have a France or a Germany to bankroll a Brussels in this region, and maybe that's not such a bad thing, but a lot of this will have to come from the countries themselves with a bit of help from others. But I think these countries will get benefit from ASEAN by promoting reforms that promote growth and hopefully more inclusive growth. Let me stop there, Aida.
Okay, no worries. I think that's really helpful. You've brought up a lot of really good points. I think just to build on that a little bit more, Shira, apologies for the wait, but I think a lot of your research is based in East Asia, and of course you have experience on Australia as well. I think particularly looking at what Jay said about countries, some of like the lesser developed countries in ASEAN being unable to, I guess, prop up themselves or rely on other ASEAN countries for, I think, the sort of financial aid that we're able to see in the EU. Could you give us some insight on how RCEP nations in general might be able to contribute to this goal of equitable development, perhaps through cooperation within the RCEP? And maybe just a little bit more briefly, just in the interest of time. Apologies.
No, thank you so much. And let me join my colleagues and panelists in congratulating you and your colleagues in organising this conference. Extremely well organised, and I'm delighted to be part of it. So Jay made the point in a slight offhand remark too, that maybe it's not too bad we don't have a Germany and France that's pouring aid into other countries. I think the experience in our part of the world, in East Asia, has been countries emulating the growth models of other countries and really joining that open international market, integrating into that international market with support from neighbours, but doing so by yourself, so not necessarily with aid. Now, broadening it out from the ASEAN grouping to the RCEP grouping, of course, my colleagues here have mentioned how diverse the region is. Well, now you're adding Japan and China, two of the three largest economies in the world, to the mix, as well as Australia, New Zealand, and other rich countries, advanced industrialized economies. And so we have more diversity in levels of development, in political systems, in cultures, as has been mentioned. And the bigger the differences, really, the bigger the gains from trade and interaction. So this should help some of the less developed countries in really weathering the storm as we try to recover from the COVID pandemic. And when I mean weathering the storm, this RCEP grouping really locks markets into being open, keeps markets open in our part of the world. And that's the most dynamic part of the global economy. So this is, I think, a sort of first necessary condition for a lot of our less developed countries in the region to catch up. So that's why I think this RCEP agreement's very important at this particular moment of time, as Alan said, strategically important here. And as Jay mentioned, we do have increasing inequality within countries. Now, that's a big agenda that cannot be ignored. The distributional consequences of development can't be ignored. We've seen what happens when they are ignored in developing and developed countries. And I think this is where something we haven't talked about yet, maybe we can talk about a bit more, RCEP's cooperation agenda. So we have a cooperation agenda within RCEP, can really help with countries trying to develop their social safety nets, experience sharing between countries and how they're managing this growing inequality. So there's a lot of potential in this agreement, as well as the already big commitments to keeping markets open and to new modern rules for commerce that's relevant in the 21st century. So look, I'll second what my colleagues have said on the panel. This is an important and big agreement. What countries get out of it really will depend on what countries put into it, how much they open up. Look, maybe I'll finish on one point. Jay mentioned a really important point where, the old problem with reform where the costs are concentrated in space and time and the benefits are spread across space and time. That makes it quite difficult to undertake reform, whether it's trade opening up or structural change of your economy. But doing so together within ASEAN grouping or larger grouping makes the pain much less and increases the benefits. So what's important for the least developed within ASEAN and even the others within RCEP is we have now a cooperation agenda and an organising framework for countries to further open up their economies and reform and to compare notes as we go along. So I might just leave that there. Thanks, Aida.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that's really helpful in, I guess, looking at how the RCEP grouping, I guess moving on, shifting gears a little bit, Another issue that some international observers have noticed is that competition between RCEP members and whether or not this might be detrimental, in particular to some small producers who may not have had equal access to infrastructure. So what we've mentioned before, I guess, with differences between countries and how they may struggle to compete in international markets as a result. So Attorney Allen, would you be able to give us a little bit of insight briefly at how RCEP members may address some of these concerns about increased competition between members with industry overlap? So that might be like looking at textiles, agriculture, manufacturing, and how that overlaps between different ASEAN countries, and why that would, and how what that might look like for ASEAN's MSMEs.
Thank you, Ada, for that question. Before I answer the same, I just want to provide some comments on the issue of development divide and try to link it with the question that you just have propounded. Number one, I think we have to recognize the fact that, as mentioned earlier, the levels of economic and even legal development of countries in the region vary. Thus, for that diversity, for that variance alone, being poor in, let's say, in a less developed country is far different from being poor in a developed country. So in other words, in terms of the determining and narrowing the gap, then as we work together, we conduct trade and investment, we narrow the gap, but in the process, there are other segments of the development gaps that we will be creating. And so in the process, we have to be mindful of that. Now, in a complex situation wherein we are in the world, wherein there is diversity when it comes to legal regime, economic structure, cultural influence, and also historical attachment, one thing that is a good equalizer are rules. So in other words, the rules-based system is very important because whether you're a developed country, least developed country, developing country, you are working on the same rules as far as doing trade, doing business, doing investment is concerned. And I think that's one big achievement of RCEP. Because when RCEP was concluded and signed, we were in the midst of a pandemic and also in a scenario wherein many countries are embracing inward policies. But here we are in the region, we have signaled to the world that RCEP countries are able, willing, and determined to comply with a rules-based system of doing trade and investment. And I think that's one big factor. Now, one issue that, of course, comes to mind is the issue of competition. I think that is something that we have to discard also or to disabuse our mind, because the notion is that if there is competition, then you are basically exposing your local industries to, I would say, a very difficult situation wherein their status in the industry will be jeopardized because of the inflow of foreign competition. But I think we have to bear in mind that competition basically guides us in finding our comparative advantage. Competition drives us to be more competitive. And just as foreign businesses, foreign investors are coming in our country, we have to bear in mind also that we can access these foreign territories or foreign market for that matter. And again, bear in mind that in this free trade area, we are working on the same rules. We are observing the same rules. And so therefore, for our stakeholders, they have to bear in mind that in choosing a place where to invest and conduct business, you have to consider that economy or that country who knows how to observe and how to respect rules. And then lastly, since you have managed to create a free trade area that observes a rules-based system, then basically you have now a platform for opportunities. So in other words, one small businessman in the Philippines will now have an opportunity to work with other big or maybe another small businessman in another territory or economy for that matter. And of course, the opportunities continues. And I think this is something that we have to embrace so that we'll see the benefits. And as mentioned by Dr. Menon earlier, we have to picture the benefits, the advantages of having this kind of system, of having this kind of free trade area. Thank you, Ada.
Well, good. Thank you so much for that. I think that links quite well, especially your points on cooperation, and I guess, yeah, how RCEP is quite outward looking as well. Okay, I guess shifting gears a little bit, I think, sorry, well, we'll look back again at the theme of RCEP's wider membership, particularly with RCEP being a pretty significant multilateral agreement. So I think, yeah, so Alan, as you mentioned, there's been quite, a tendency towards inward looking and protectionist sentiment, both in the US and across the globe. So I guess it might be interesting to discuss how the RCEP and its members fit into the bigger picture of global trade and leadership, and what impact RCEP may have on economic cooperation within the Asia Pacific. Shira, you mentioned an economic cooperation agenda within the RCEP. Would you like to expand a little bit more on that and address the question as well?
Yeah, thanks, Ida. Look, I'll just start off by with a small comment on the previous question, which I'm in full agreement with the answer on. But thinking about competition here and the way you sort of asked the question, that has an implication that it's going to be tough for some industries and some companies, and it will be. But competition's good. We're not going to have internationally competitive companies if they're not exposed to international competition. So I think that's pretty important to remember. And the history of the region, really, you look at ASEAN opening up to trade with China and a lot of people worrying about industries being wiped out. Well, a lot of companies were able to, and a lot of countries and industries were able to join these supply chains and really benefit from the mutually beneficial trade with China. So I think, the competition here is good. And we've got transparent rules, predictable rules that stop countries from retreating to protectionism. So your question on protectionism is an important one. There's actually some recent research that shows after the last pandemic we had, the Spanish flu, that countries that had more deaths from that pandemic had higher and raised tariffs higher, and they raised them faster after the pandemic. So I think we're in for a rough ride going forward. Anyway, when you have a recession like this and a global recession, we see there's a bit of a lag and a rise in protectionism. So as I mentioned earlier, this is particularly why RCEP is important now. Locking these markets, and some very big markets and rapidly growing markets, into new rules, into keeping their markets open. And given the size that we've talked about, the size of the grouping, it is systemically significant in the international trading system. So the 15 members, large economies, of course, this is bigger than any bilateral agreement. It's the biggest free trade agreement. Jay mentioned the all carrots and no sticks approach to cooperation and it's, slow consensus building. Well, this is the first time in this region that we've got legally binding commitments, and that's significant. And that was, as you mentioned, took a fair while to get there, 8-9 years, but in the whole scheme of things, probably not that long, and most welcome. So that's where the agreement's big enough to have a positive impact on global trade that's much needed at this particular time, with North America and Europe looking at a bit of a retreat into protectionism, even under the Biden administration, this foreign policy for middle class and no interest in joining trade agreements or opening up. There's not a trade agenda yet. So that's why I think it's very important at this particular time. And on the cooperation agenda, I think this is a real area of opportunity for the agreement that's really yet to be defined, I think, and is sort of up for grabs. So it's a big opportunity. This is where a lot of the behind the border issues that, probably shouldn't or couldn't be negotiated can be talked about between countries. Can discuss COVID exit strategies and recovery plans, other issues like the social safety net issue I mentioned, new disciplines and rules on digital trade, discussing infrastructure investment cooperation. So there are a whole host of issues. It's just a matter of getting that framework right so that we can really cooperate. And it's beyond technical cooperation and capacity building. It's really about experience sharing. And we've had a lot of that in our region through APEC and through ASEAN. I think that now can be formalized in the RCEP agreement. And I think there's a lot of work to do there, including from those like myself and Jay who are outside the official process to help with some ideas and some how to frame that cooperation. Thanks.
Oh, good. Oh, sorry.
Can I just add a little bit to what Shira was just saying? Because I think this point about how we deal with the rising protectionist sentiments that the pandemic has fueled, is going to be critical for how we recover in the next year to 5 years going forward. The anti-globalization tendencies were there before COVID, but they found new fodder through COVID. But there's been a bit of a shift, I think, from trade liberalization or the unequal costs and benefits of trade liberalization within countries and between countries, a shift from that to factor mobility, labor and capital mobility. That's where the attention seems to be very gradually shifting. So my fear is that a lot of these barriers that have been raised, like barriers to people movement in the name of COVID health protection, may remain a lot longer than warranted in a post-COVID new normal. So this is what we need to be very concerned about, I think, going forward. And protectionism now has also new names. I mean, even resilience is now used and abused as a way of trying to push China out of supply chains, right? I mean, there's good reasons to improve resilience of supply chains, but when it's used to actually try and push out China, this is neither sensible or possible. I mean, so we need to, look at how protectionism reemerges in disguised forms. Reshoring is the best example. I mean, this is not stopping FDI flows, but reversing FDI flows. I mean, FDI is the lifeblood of globalization and of supply chains. So I think hopefully RCEP will provide the kind of safety net, if you like, to try and keep what we've achieved in place and bring down new barriers that are rising because of COVID. Let me stop there. Thank you.
No worries. I think that's really, really helpful, particularly on the addition of, how are we dealing with China? Because I think that's quite a big one, and protectionism in regards to that. Okay, I guess wrapping up on that and looking towards the future. Our past 2 years, as you guys have mentioned, have been pretty significantly affected by the pandemic situation. And obviously one of the issues arising out of this has been the impact on world economies. So maybe looking at how once in force, ASEAN and its dialogue partners may be able to utilize the RCEP to achieve a more equitable and efficient post-COVID economic recovery. And Elizabeth, if you'd like to give some insight on this.
Sure, thanks, Ada. And I'm happy to start, but I think my colleagues will also have a lot to add, and in fact have already addressed this issue in some respect in addressing the previous question. But I think going back to some of the points I made in my earlier intervention, the tools that RCEP provides by providing a set of standards and rules of origin for traders in the region to access will increase efficiencies in trade, which is really core to open supply chains. And as Jay and others have said, supply chains have been under pressure during the pandemic. So rules and frameworks that ensure security of supply chains will further support our COVID-19 economic recovery, but also importantly, rules that support the flow of capital and people. So there are mobility outcomes in RCEP once our borders reopen, which I think hopefully will be very soon. We've learned as an experience of closing our borders that in fact we suffer from skills deficits, which can be addressed through the free flow of people, or at least greater mobility amongst our region. So that's another important way, once the borders reopen, in which we can support COVID-19 economic recovery. Shira also focused on the inbuilt economic cooperation agenda. And I do think it's really important to note that while RCEP's ultimate objective is to achieve trade liberalisation, this inbuilt economic agenda does contain what is a really important element, not the sole element, of the capacity building to ensure that its members, all RCEP members, can take advantage of the reform and trade liberalisation that the agreement can provide, which will then make those economies able to meet future shocks, such as those imposed by pandemics, in a more resilient way. Now, Australia is a very strong supporter of the economic cooperation agenda, and in fact, we're designing our regional Trade for Development initiative, which is very much linked to RCEP and implementing the economic cooperation agenda, building upon the agenda and the economic cooperation that we have under ANZFTA. In particular, I do think it's really important, just picking up from a point that Alan also made, as RCEP signalling a commitment to rules-based trade, which in turn reinforces the multilateral trading system. So our experience in COVID-19 and challenges to supply chains in Australia is, in fact, the best defense we've had is by maintaining open, free, liberalised trade. And so a framework such as RCEP that provides a platform for rules-based trade in the region is really important to reinforce that centrality, not only of ASEAN, but also of the multilateral trading system, which will in turn support COVID-19 economic recovery. Thanks, Ada.
Oh, good. Were there any other insights that other speakers would like to give in regards to that?
Can I jump in very quickly, Ada? The couple of people have mentioned supply chain resilience, and this, of course, we're all a little bit worried about disruptions to supply chains during the pandemic. I think going forward, we're going to have to be pretty clear about what we're doing, because we could make things much worse by intervening in the wrong way. As Jay mentioned, sometimes supply chain resilience is thought of as trying to become resilient from the Chinese economy by trying to extract our supply chains from China. Well, that's not possible, nor is it sensible, as he said. But also, it's also code for onshoring manufacturing. Now, that doesn't make your economy more resilient, and in fact concentrates risk. So we start onshoring all our much more of our manufacturing or production. It's more susceptible to drought, floods, all sorts of things. And in the case of other countries in the region, earthquakes and other shocks. So, these are supply chains spread across the region and across the global economy precisely to diversify risk. So I think it's pretty important not to go in and try to distort them without understanding the consequences. And one, I guess, sort of benign intervention that was made was Japanese government policies to subsidize onshoring from supply chains, but also to expand supply chains in Southeast Asia. And they were called in the press as China exit subsidies, because they were onshoring $2 billion of subsidies to onshore, $200 million worth of subsidies to expand to Southeast Asia. And of course, companies took all of that up. It was oversubscribed, as you would. If you're a company, you take free money. It's corporate welfare. But that flew in the face of $11 billion of Japanese investment flooding into China. It was just an absolute waste of money and actually concentrated some risks in Japan. So I think we've got to be pretty careful about that, and things like diversifying our trade, which we're all about in Australia right now. A lot of people thinking about diversifying our trade. I don't really think that's a great idea either. I think we should let those decisions be left to the market, where they can make better decisions. I can expand on that if you want, but maybe we should move on.
No worries. Yeah, I guess if there were no further comments on the COVID recovery, maybe we'll just move on to Q&A. Yeah, okay. So I guess the first question that we've had is, or one of the first questions that we've had, hold on, let me scroll to find it. Apologies for this. Okay, so I think one thing that's been mentioned is that, sorry, the audience would like to know what emerging sector has the greatest potential for sustainable and profitable future in the ASEAN, looking at like trade of resources, services, etc. So this is just open to the panel, I guess. Or if not, Attorney Ellen, would you be able to give any insights to this?
Well, I think when it comes to opportunities that will be created in the region, there are many sectors that can benefit from it. But as to the emerging ones, maybe top of mind that I can think of would be the electronics industry. As mentioned earlier, the pandemic has accelerated our demand for digital, of course, gadgets, digital environment has to be enhanced. So I think that's one. And then number two, I think infrastructure and investments also in the power sector and telecommunication sector would be expected. Because while we enhance our digital environment, it has to be supported by this sector, power and logistics, and also telecommunication sector. Thank you.
Ida, can I come in on that? I think I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm not good at this stuff. So I'm not going to say too much about where the future lies. But I think Alan has really hit on it. It's the digital economy, and how many things that were not digital are turning digital in terms of their delivery possibilities. And we, I guess this webinar is the perfect example. But I think it also highlights how, and this will link back to the earlier point that Shira was making, about how the digitization of supply chains is actually reducing the need for proximity. So all this talk about reshoring so that we have better control over supply chains, the need for that is reduced, not increased by digitization. So this is a very bad excuse to reshore now that we have increasing levels of digitization, which means the distance is less of a factor. And then one final point is that I think this pandemic has demonstrated how resilient supply chains actually are, rather than the opposite. People often say, oh, well, there was a lot of disruption because of the pandemic, disruption of supply chains. It wasn't because we had supply chains. It's because, most of the world turned off the engine of the economies for 2 months. Whether you had supply chains or not, there would have been disruption. Supply chains get disrupted when you have individual events, I think they're called high impact, low probability events in individual countries, not in the globe, which is what the pandemic was, right? So the Thai floods of 2011 highlighted the vulnerability of supply chains because one segment of the chain broke down in Thailand and the whole thing got disrupted. But when the whole economy, global economy, is disrupted by a global pandemic, that doesn't highlight the vulnerability of supply chains. That highlights the vulnerability of a global pandemic and nothing more. So I think using the pandemic to push resilience and so on is actually just a new way of either vested interest pushing for domestic reshoring, or again, and China bashing. I mean, I think we need to be clear about how the pandemic has affected supply chains. Thank you, Ida. I know I went a bit away from that question, but I think that's an important part of how we look at what the pandemic has done and hasn't done. Thank you.
No worries, that's pretty helpful, particularly looking at supply chain resilience. Elizabeth, I noticed earlier that you unmuted. Was there anything that you wanted to add to that?
Thanks very much, Ada. Actually, I was also going to mention the importance of the digital rules and the e-commerce rules in the agreement, precisely picking up the point that Jane made about the increasing shift brought about by the pandemic, the experience we've had of digitalization, and moving to a digital economy, and the centrality of digital trade rules to supporting the new ways of doing business, which have been given impetus potentially under the pandemic, but were already emerging. So I think that's an important element of the RCEP agreement. I do think I've spoken a lot about the importance of common sets of rules and standards, but the services elements and providing certainty for business in terms of services exports, or the services economy, which really is so important for so many economies in the region, is another key feature of the agreement. So rather than focusing on one particular area, I would say that it provides that certainty that's needed for businesses in the region that are services-based businesses to invest and expand into other economies in the RCEP framework.
Okay, yes, thank you. I think that's quite helpful, particularly looking at services, which I'm not sure we've done as much in this discussion. Yeah, so I guess we'll wrap up that question. And maybe our second and our final question for the Q&A is something I don't think we've touched on in discussion either. Someone's mentioned whether or not there should be considerations of an ASEAN Central Bank being established to build critical infrastructure in the region in order to solidify ASEAN's soft power influence in the Indo-Pacific. Yeah, I'm not sure about that one. Attorney Allen, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, of course, that is something to be studied and evaluated by experts. But if there is one benefits that I have noted in the study conducted by UNCTAD, one of the benefits of RCEP is what they call the regional investment financial integration. So expect more mergers and acquisitions between and among different financial institutions. And the same can fuel also investment on infrastructure development. So I think that's one thing that I can share. But as to the establishment of ASEAN Central Bank, I think that has to be studied and further evaluated.
Ida, can I add to that?
Yes, of course.
Right. So I think by central bank, I presume the questioner is talking about a centralized development bank and or regional development bank, and we have several of those. I used to work for one called ADB, and we have now the AIIB, of course, often wrongly described as a China bank, but speaking of which, there's also the Belt and Road Initiative. So there are various initiatives that are looking to address the huge infrastructure deficit in this region, I don't think they need to compete really, because the demands are so great. We could do with another 10 AIIBs or ADBs and still not meet what's actually required. And not, the World Bank also operates in this region. So, but if the person's talking about a central bank for a common currency, then I think we just have to look to Europe to realize why that's certainly a bad idea. Yeah, back to you, Ida.
Okay, No worries. Actually, no, we shouldn't. I don't know if we have time for another question. Okay, so I guess we'll just wrap up with that. I think this conversation has been quite helpful in bringing to light a few key parts of trade in ASEAN, and I think that might be looking at cooperation in the region, whether that's through the regional cooperation agenda or just through partnerships that have been built as a result. I think also looking at the idea of a more rules-based trade and how that's, I think, as a few of you have mentioned, led to supply chains remaining open and resilience, particularly through the COVID pandemic. And yeah, I think allowing for a lot of countries to hopefully deal better with that. And yeah, looking into recovery next year as well. That'll be quite big. Yeah, I think also RCEP as a platform for discussion and cooperation as well. Were there any other key points that any of our speakers would like to give to the audience? So anything that you might hope the audience takes away from this conversation? Yes, sure.
I might just jump in very quickly, just a small, but I think fairly important point. The principles within which ASEAN integrates with its own economy and the global economy, principles of multilateralism and principles of multipolarity, are even more important today as we face strategic competition between the United States and China. So this RCEP agreement couldn't come at a better time. The potential expansion of the CPTPP and other rules, other market openings and progress that we can make on this front, where we can push multilateralism, that's going to have huge economic benefits, but also security, political security and security benefits, because multilateralism diffuses economic and political power. And I think that's going to become even more important going forward, given the United States and China and the difficulty that we're all facing with that strategic competition and the uncertainty that that brings, and that we're going to see as we try to recover from the pandemic as well. Thanks, Ada.
Oh, good. I think that's quite a lovely point to look at, especially with, I think we'll have another few panels that look at the issue of China and the US as well. So if anyone in the audience is interested, please look to the agenda and see when those will be on. Were there any other comments that our speakers would like to give? No? Okay. If not, thank you so much for all of today and the discussion that we've been able to have. It's been really quite interesting for me to hear more about your expertise and what you think about these issues, and I'm sure for the audience as well. So I'd like to thank you guys again for volunteering your time to present us with such an engaging discussion, and as well as for your cooperation over the past months. I'd like to thank our audience as well for their participation today. Our Q&A discussion was quite interesting, particularly focusing again on supply chains, and it wouldn't have been the same without that. So it's been quite a packed day today with our back-to-back keynotes, our networking session, and our discussion just then. So we'll be having a short 15-minute break where you guys will be quite welcome to hang around in our lobby or in our networking hall to chat, or just to take a well-deserved screen break. So following the break, there'll be another set of parallel panel discussions on protecting migrants and labor from exploitation, as well as the threat of information in the political sphere. And you'll be able to find more on these in our agenda. So thank you once again for joining our panel discussion today, and please enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. Thank you, Ada. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ada.
Thank you.